Thank you. I'm honored to be here with you this evening to share my story. Medical school did not begin the way I expected, but then again, neither did my life. I was born with a heart defect, having my first open heart surgery when I was 2 years old. Growing up, I loved my pediatric cardiologist. By the time I was 4 years old, I had already told my parents that I wanted to be a pediatric cardiologist just like the doctor who had helped save me. I don't ever recall wanting to do anything else. I wanted to help kids with the same condition as mine. But to reach my medical career goal, it would take surviving my illness and years of study. Through the years, my body responded well to the treatments and procedures I would undergo, enabling me to overcome the challenge of surviving and living a full life. I'm here tonight because of it, and as I said earlier, grateful to be here with you. Medical school delivered challenges of its own. I met them all, but not without some struggles along the way. During Tulane Medical School orientation, before classes had even begun, one of the pediatric faculty members became interested in why I was so confident that I wanted to be a pediatric cardiologist. I responded by bringing up my medical history as it related to my future. On the second day of class, I received a note that a meeting was going to be arranged between Tulane's pediatric cardiologist and myself, just in case I found medical school to be stressful. I left the meeting that day with a recommendation to have a second open heart surgery. I had just seen my pediatric cardiologist. He had told me to go and join medical school. One of the first things I learned in medical school is that medicine is gray and that two physicians can look at the same patient and come up with two different conclusions, and neither of them are wrong. Medicine is gray. I had successful valve replacement surgery between my first and second year of medical school. During my third year of medical school, our internal medicine clerkship director, Dr. Ledoux, noticed that I had scored lower on the standardized exam than she had expected. She was an adult cardiologist, and she asked to meet with me to discuss my score. She asked about my family's educational background and how I had done in school as a child. I reluctantly shared some things with her that day. My mother had graduated from high school, but my father had not. No one in my immediate family had ever gone to college. As far as academics were concerned, I had been tested for special education in kindergarten, and I ultimately failed the first grade because my reading ability was not at grade level. My parents separated just as I was beginning medical school, and my mom raised me as a single working parent while working nights as a correctional officer. There wasn't a lot of time for her to help me with my studies, although she did her best. Considering all of that, Dr. Ledoux told me that many patients with congenital heart defects like mine have underlying learning disabilities. She asked more questions about elementary, high school, and college. I told her I began to do well in school after repeating first grade. I used to lie in the middle of my living room floor while my mom called material out to me until I could recite it back to her like a well-told story. On the nights that my mom worked, she would call out material to me in the morning between the time she got home from work and I called the school bus. I told Dr. Ledoux that I began to make all A's after receiving a wish from the Starlight Children's Foundation because of my heart condition. When I was 12 years old, Starlight made it possible for me to travel to Los Angeles, where I would meet the cast of my favorite TV show. To me at the time, if I could go from my little rural community in Louisiana to Los Angeles to see these people that I saw perform every week on television, then anything was possible. And that experience just filled me with hope. By the time I was in high school, I had been labeled academically gifted, even though the testing showed a significant difference between my verbal and visuospatial skills. Even though I was doing well in school, I never really enjoyed reading. I found myself having to read things 2 or 3 times to get the meaning of what was on the page, especially in literature and history classes. I didn't mind reading encyclopedias or science books. I liked learning new facts. My gifted classmates noticed my work ethic and often teased me for taking every textbook home with me every day. They would tell me to slow down, to quit blowing the curve. But to me, it felt like I was barely keeping up. I graduated at the very top of my high school and college classes. I told Dr. Ledoux I didn't understand how I could have done so well in school and have a learning problem. She suggested that I had learned to compensate for a learning disability. She continued to ask questions about my learning style, and I shared my formula for success with her. I would start studying the material immediately. I would type my notes. I would read them aloud over and over again. To ensure success, I took as many mathematics and physical science classes as I could because I had a natural ability in those subjects. For my liberal arts classes, I would research the professors and find out which classes had minimal outside reading. I would ask questions. I would even make myself available to my classmates to help answer their questions. If I could teach someone else the material, it just confirmed to me that I knew the material well. After relaying all the above information to Dr. Ledoux, I was still reluctant to be tested for a disability, but she was insistent, even to the point of offering to arrange and pay for the testing herself. She told me that she didn't want to see a learning problem keep my dreams from coming to fruition. I ultimately agreed, and I was subsequently diagnosed with a reading learning disorder with the advisement that I receive extra time on standardized exams in medical school. Stubbornly, I refused the accommodation. I was already the student with a heart defect. I didn't want to be the one with a learning disability too. Luckily, most exams in medical school were not standardized, and I was ranked at the top half of my tooling class, but I never scored above average on a time standardized exam. In fact, I passed the first step of my medical licensing exam with only a few points to spare. In 2010, after completing my pediatric cardiology fellowship at Mayo Clinic, I traveled to San Francisco to take my pediatric cardiology boards. I knew I had not done well on the exam because I didn't have time to read each question thoroughly. I would have to wait 2 years to retake the exam. It was then that I decided to retake the exam with accommodation, and I submitted the required documents. Nearly a year later, I still had not heard anything regarding my request. So I called their office to inquire, and a staff member told me that while no official decision had been made, that my testing was old, and that my request would most likely be denied. So I proactively found a new educational psychologist and was retested. He confirmed my reading learning disorder, but he also diagnosed me with nonverbal learning disorder. I had never heard of NVLD before. It hadn't been covered in any of my med school classes on learning disabilities. I resubmitted my application for accommodation, and a few months later I received a letter stating that my request was again denied, because the methods used to arrive at my reading disorder diagnosis were psychometrically unsound, and there was a lack of a documented history of a reading disorder. I spoke to one of my mentors at Mayo Clinic, who just happened to previously be the committee chair for the pediatric cardiology board exam. He indicated that he had never heard of anyone receiving accommodation for the examination, but he encouraged me to press on. I decided to have a different psychologist retest me. Luckily, my mom had kept most of my school records. I was able to provide him with documentation that demonstrated a consistent pattern of learning difficulties, which he described as global developmental delays, including deficits in fine motor skills, symbol recognition, and word identification skills. He reported that my reading scores had been consistently my lowest scores. He further clarified that my reading disability was a visual-spatial issue and not a matter of verbal ability. He stated that over time I had developed compensatory learning processes and that my auditory memory, verbal abilities, and mathematical abilities were developed to high levels of proficiency. He also pointed out that a reading disorder is a well-established condition associated with my underlying heart defect. I thought surely this would do the trick. Wrong again. I received a letter stating that I had missed the deadline to apply for accommodation. In fact, their correspondence came 3 days after the deadline. At this point, I was angry, but I am determined and sometimes stubborn, and I don't give up easily. So I sent a letter to the testing committee detailing the timeline of events, even suggesting that my file was purposely delayed with the intent of denying me accommodation. With a few weeks to spare, I received notification that they had again reviewed my documentation and that they had approved my accommodation. I passed the exam with a score just inside the top quartile. It marked the first time I had received an above average score on a timed medical exam. I was diagnosed with NVLD as an adult after I had completed a rigorous course of study. Over the last year, I have been in touch with the researchers at Columbia and Johns Hopkins universities who work with the NVLD project. They are working on getting this developmental visual spatial disorder officially recognized so that future medical students can learn about it and those that suffer from it can get the help that they need. It has been fascinating to retrospectively look at specific life events and realize that I didn't just have a reading disability. In kindergarten, I never received a satisfactory mark in doing my papers neatly, finishing a task, identifying body parts, using scissors correctly, tying my shoes, sequencing events through pictures, or distinguishing left and right. I finally learned left and right when I was learning to drive, but I use the term learn loosely. I finally realized that I read from left to right, and I would just refer to that definition anytime that I needed to distinguish the two. And that worked well unless I needed to distinguish them fast. A recent trip to the chiropractor confirmed I still don't know my left and right. If you ask me to do it quickly, I don't know. And sometimes even a doctor just has to laugh at himself. I still vividly remember the 2 questions I missed on my 4th grade midterm exams. I failed to identify east and west correctly on a map. If you stop and think about it, it's a lot like not knowing your left from your right. Today, I can identify east and west on a map, but I still can't use directions meaningfully. This became apparent when I was a fellow in pediatric cardiology, and my program director gave me driving directions telling me to turn east off of a northbound highway. He could tell from the look on my face I had no clue what he was talking about. Learning to drive was a substantial feat within and of itself. My first vehicle was a standard transmission Isuzu pickup truck. I learned to drive on the mile-long gravel road leading to our country home. There was no traffic. There wasn't much traffic in the small town where I went to high school either. Where I went to college was a little bit bigger. My best friend there was Matt, and he was from Dallas, Texas. He was the first person I'd ever met that understood math the way that I did. Our claim to fame was that we were the only 2 students exempt from our calculus final because we had near perfect scores. However, riding in a car with me would absolutely frustrate Matt. I was overly cautious. I was slow. I once sat at an intersection for several minutes because I couldn't safely judge when to merge into oncoming traffic. I eventually learned to pick a stationary object and use that as a reference. Matt noticed other things too. Once he was amused while I was having a conversation with someone. I was standing too close to them. Each time the individual took a step away from me, I took a step towards them. Matt was never shy about sharing his observations with me. That is how close we were as friends. And I am thankful for his feedback because it allowed me to make corrections. Even in the workforce, I have had to learn to use feedback as a means to which to adjust. My first job out of fellowship was just not a good fit for me. The lead physician was overly critical. At one point, he had told me a decision I had made was wrong and had caused a family to worry needlessly about their child. When I explained to him that I had discussed my decision with a more senior physician in our group, he told me that asking for help was just a sign of weakness. I couldn't win with him. Eventually, I left the practice splintered and other physicians left as well. The experience reminds me of the importance of finding a good fit in the workforce, where my strengths and weaknesses are appreciated. I'm proud to say that my current practice values diversity, and it has allowed me to be successful. My current patient experience scores are within the top 1% of our multi-specialty group practice of over 1,000 medical providers. The work that the NVLD project is doing is so crucial. Getting this learning disability officially recognized is so important for patients with it. Recognition can enable them to receive the accommodation they need in school and in the workplace to reach success, and like me, see dreams come to fruition. Thank you.